Today we're going to draw and watercolor the Victory of Samothrace, a beautiful sculpture with excellent forms, trying to work out the light by really doing a deep study of values. Let's get to it. I'm going to be working on rough watercolor paper. This is a little bit more grain on our arches. It's a smaller format. This is a little bit less, it's 5x8. So I want to make sure I keep track of what I'm focusing on. As I mentioned, I want to do this through a value study. So for that, I'll bring in our friend, the grayscale value finder, considering value 1 as our darkest, our black, and value 10 as our white, the white of our paper. My goal for today is going to try to really push these values and the contrast between one step to the next, as we see them here, between 4 and 5, ideally you want to maybe 7, and that would include darkest, lightest, that's 2, and then at least 3 to 4, maybe 5 more, which would be, in many cases, pushed through a monochromatic, which is what I'm going to try to do today, by selecting just one color. And we have this beautiful marble. It has that warm yellow light. So choosing one color and playing with the consistency and value of that one color is a great challenge that I suggest, and is what I will be trying to do today. Now there are options to push some of those shadow areas with a little bit of the complementary color. So for example, if I'm using yellow ochre or a sepia for my general color, I could bring in a little bit of violet or mixture of purples to create the contrast. You can easily do that with black as well, and try to push the shadow areas, which we have some very nice ones here. So as we get to drawing, I'm gonna invite you to really play with this composition. So we have this image right in the center. Again, according to your format, you want to work that center line, a little bit of the beam, the anatomy. We have this beautiful pose with turns and twists, and then there's that wing with all the beautiful shapes and textures in there. A big part of this is going to be working the drapery, the fabric, and the light on that fabric, which is where most of that value work is going to take place. So there's going to be that. And as you develop your drawing, there's also a little bit of background or some of the space. So for example, I'll start with this, which we have this beautiful diagonal on the base. And I'm using pencil, HB lead, on my mechanical pencil to show you how from the bottom, and you could create a more dramatic angle. I'm actually tilting it a little less and working my way upward. I want to make sure I have, number one, the proportions and the composition. So taking my measurements, I want to make sure I do sort of an envelope study. And as I mentioned, I want this to be delicate. So my lines are going to be very, very light at first. And as you do your first step in drawing, I really want you to make sure you use your pencil, using a good look on your reference to make sure you measure. You have a unit of measure that will give you the length and width ratio. And if you measure this and you begin to see the form with just a little bit of angle, as always, I recommend the formulas of simplicity, simplifying all your lines, all your shapes, and eventually your values too. Making sure you leave your drawing and your painting open as long as possible. So all I want to do now is capture these angles. And as I have my measurement, and I notice that my unit of measure, the side all the way to the tip of the wing, is just about, and I'll double check that, It's about 1 to 1 1/3 the height. I want to make sure I reach the overall envelope of the shape. And just like this masterful sculptor did, carve it out through straight line study. So I want to start with the biggest, and then again the simplest. Making great observations to set yourself up for a good opening that will work all the way through. Now, this is always open for play. The idea here is to have fun with this. As usual, I recommend using this as your reference for inspiration and managing your level of expectation. What are you trying to work with today? Is it the drawing? Are you trying to do a photorealistic approach to the drawing? Do you want it to be more gestural, more expressive? As I mentioned, I'm going to be working with the value approach, something that I really want to, once I get to that stage, and in a way I'm in that stage now. I'm setting myself up for that later part of the work. So whatever I can do now here with line, that helps me. And that would be some of the light maps. But overall, and I mentioned this a lot, it's mostly exercise and observation. I'm zooming in just a little bit more to my reference as I need to see it just a little bit closer. Now, whether you do envelope or you do blind contour drawing, all of these, I want us to show you something today here. Since we have a beautiful torso and we have a turn, stretch, tilt, I want to find that center line. We actually see the belly button, and I want to point out we see the upper torso, the abdomen, and then the hip. So all of these beautiful curves and then volumes that I could start off with these lines could easily be hinted at and set up from these fundamentals. From finding your center line, from finding some of the angles. So notice here we have these angles where you see one shoulder, and that's the perspective of it, higher than the other. And you see a little bit of the tilt and a little bit of that beginning of curvature, the roundness of this torso, with the pinch and the stretch on the other side. That actually is relevant just as well to the fabric that's going to be emphasizing all of that. So finding a way to relax through this, really breaking it down, breaking down the information, not forgetting what it is you need to, and how you need to look at what's in front of you. To not let any subject overwhelm you, and have a game plan which you could always refer back to and make anything work. Once again, using all of those, using a little bit of negative space as well, I begin to add more curved lines. Moving away, I see my proportion and general ratios working here. So I want to save some time, move a little bit ahead in the stage of this drawing. But again, I highly recommend, as long as you can stay in that open, fundamental stage, if you could do that all the way through, and I call it just a sketching mentality. If you have that loose sketch mentality that does not become stiff at any point. That's actually the ideal. If you walk away and you were able to achieve that consciously, that's a big, big plus. Noticing what it is that, where your eye wanders, what it is that you choose to see, because it's all there. All of the information is there. And deciding what goes and what doesn't, editing process, as I am doing now with each one of these lines, and realizing how that is working is where I want you to somehow not overthink it, but be aware. And it becomes more obvious usually, well, at the end, when we take a look at it, and then we can analyze and critique. So hopefully you'll pay attention to how some of those decisions were made. What can you trace it back? Were you looking and using the methods that actually help you? And it works both ways. Generally looking at the positives and hoping to remember, how did I do that? That's a big one. But also the negatives, where we think, oh, I don't know, what happened here? How did that come to be? And not being able to recall, well, what was the thought process? So as you can see, we begin to see the form, we begin to identify. I see that pose that I was trying to achieve here coming together. I don't want to jump way ahead. That would be jumping way ahead as I begin to look at some of these folds. But what you want to do is break those, and yes, they become more linear, and that is one facet of art that it just takes practice. And if you've never done fabric or drapery, especially from a sculpture, it's something that you really, really need to be patient with, to break down all of that information. It requires lots of patience, but lots of discipline. Lots of discipline in terms of knowing that eventually it's all lines, and those lines that are not as clear now in terms of shape, they become more linear, but then the value of those shapes also becomes difficult to render, because it then depends on technique. And that is going to be the technique of how when we watercolor this, how I manage the wet on wet or wet on dry, and soft edges, hard edges, and the shifting values, which is my goal, my main focus today. Obviously, all of the goals are, having a beautiful drawing, taking that drawing, and then adding beautiful softness and shadows to it. But if you were to pick one thing, for me, it's going to be value study. So it's going to happen a lot on my palette as I work with the consistency of the pigment, but I will also use that, bring it to the paper, and that will be your technical skill practice of the day. Things that you choose to focus on. Sometimes subconsciously you're doing it, you're not really aware. Today I want to bring that more to a more conscious place as I work through it. So here we are, reaching a little bit of how much detail is needed to begin a drawing like this. Is where's the border between how much detail in my drawing I need to be able to begin painting, or it actually becomes a drawing. It's a fine line, and I always say having a good drawing sets you up for a good watercolor, but there's a limit in how much information becomes too much information. So that is why I'm a little careful, not so much so here. I do want maybe some pencil lines to show up here. So beyond the edge, and as I see some of these linear shadow or edges coming here, I may heighten or enhance just a little bit of line work to showcase that, to help with the edge as I begin adding my paint. Using negative space for this type of drawing in this area here should be, or should help you make it a little bit easier. This is a form that, unless you're regularly drawing wings, you're going to want to somehow make a little more abstract. One of the ways is identifying the form, but the outer form, meaning the negative space. So in this case, I'm looking more at the curvature. Remember, it's going a little bit to the side, but also backwards. So how do I achieve those angles? And that's the trick, making sure you capture the shape of that line and then the angle of that line. So very soft curves, and just some of those shifts in the edge and the contour. Now, most of the work that I see with this draping, and I see some lines, I don't want to add more line to it than I already have. I'm going to be working with smaller brushes, and as I develop layers of washes, I want that to begin to showcase just a little bit more. Now, there is one big thing, which is the light. We definitely want to preserve the light. So my first job will be to give it a full wash. And it'll be probably a wet on dry wash. Using one of my bigger brushes. And having selected the color that I'm going to want to work with, which I think I actually have a tube of raw sienna. That would be beautiful. Now, can you use more than one color? Absolutely. Do you see it? If you see that nice warm yellow and there's touches of orange or red, yes, push your color, push the spectrum. Don't make it overwhelming. My recommendation for an exercise like this is to stick to just one color. Maybe add a second for neutralizing or shadows if you don't want to just, but you could do it just with one pigment. Obviously, you have pigments that granulate a little more, so you may want to play with that, or that are more transparent or more staining, so you have to consider that. I'm going to grab a quick tube of paint. And another consideration. So I have these. These are raw sienna, and this one is goethite, which is a brown ochre. It is a pigment. Let me see here. It's a PY43. And it does have this beautiful sort of granulating. I was recommended for landscapes to do sand and rock. So I may test this. Don't use it regularly. I have tested it and I do like it. So one way would be to create just a nice soft, and remember, now we begin where I begin to think about value, I'm going to be doing lots and lots of squinting. But I want my palette. Well, I'll show you really quick here. I have an area of this palette where I'm going to be adding lots and lots of water to really lower value, and I'm going to thicken. So as I get closer to this lump here, and it gets thicker all the way to big thick paint, what I want to do is create sort of a spectrum by adding lighter and more water, and make sure I mix plenty of it as I need. And that's pretty much my approach. If I stick to just one color, make sure I have a nice light wash for this first stage. Now I'm going to stay within the figure. I could bring it out. It's such light color. Such a light color that you would probably want to incorporate the background at this stage. I'm just testing the color and the low value of this first. And I'm doing it in the shadow area because I know, very forgiving, I could just layer that as much as I want. And bringing it into the figure where I begin to see shadow areas. Now it's pretty much a flat wash all the way through, adding a little water here and there to lighten some of that. And the other thing you can begin to do is play with technique. It would be to actually do wet on wet, which is going to take a little bit more patience and obviously a little more mastery of your technique. So really watching the moisture level that you're bringing in. As you decide which technique serves you best. So in this handling of light and shadow with a figure like this, we obviously have super light areas. So the technique of lifting, some may think, well, can I just use some white watercolor? Again, the simpler and less pigments you bring in, the better. But yeah, that would be one choice. Lighten it. Make a little extra contrast going towards the light if that works for you. I have buff titanium instead of white. Mixing just a little bit of that. I'm going to test it here. The effect is not much. The white of the paper is where I really want. And using whether it's a paper towel tissue or a dry brush to do this, that's how I'm going to, as you can see, begin to develop that sense of gradual rolling of the light. So I've said it again and again. Exercises in observation. And you begin to see, as I develop a little more light, a little more shadow, I want to also see how, at some point, my darkest, and it's still very wet, just how far I can push a level of contrast. And you want sort of a hint, a clue of where that's going to be and what that's going to look. Sooner rather than later. And that would be somewhere over here as well. So I'm just picking up pure pigment here and using a little bit of the wet, that moisture that's still on the paper. And this is where using one color for a monochromatic study of value and the choice of maybe bringing a complementary color or a or a black to create that shade is going to be a big decision, a big factor, depending on the choice you make. And sometimes seeing it, you need to see it if you haven't made a decision. But once you lay it down, this would be the first way to go. Test it first. And if it isn't working, then you have the option to then bring in a second pigment. If you do the opposite first, if you're not sure, and you bring in a little bit of, let's say, ivory black or lamp black to create that shade, it could stain it, and then you'll be pretty much committed. So as this dries just a little bit, and I like this first wash, there's a sense of, and I like a little bit of the granulation that's going on. I'll be able to work it more linear and softer edges. That's one thing where as I develop later stages, the layers that will come later on, I could also work them almost in a linear fashion where I could just soften some of those brush strokes and soften some of those edges as if I were drawing them in. Just adding a little more contrast here before I move on. And I'm making my next decision, which would be background. Because I don't want to wait too long, and I want to see how far or how I could use these value studies within and add maybe contrast by darkening, and just enough. It doesn't have to be a dark background, but bringing out some of this light through just a hint of a darker value in the background. Now you notice that there's also this yellowish, so I may go with the raw sienna. So they're going to be very, very close. It will have that monochromatic. So I'm going to test that. I also want it to be very, very low value. So I'm going to be adding lots and lots of water. It does have just a touch of, it's warmer. It feels like just a little redder, whereas this one is a browner. And I'm going to just get a sense of dry brush, not more of an atmospheric approach to the background. I don't want any of the brick, or not interested in any detail. I want all of it. If anything, down here in this area, I will probably add some directional brushstroke here, a little more consistency, as you can see, just to show some of that rock, the crevice where you see a bit of edge. But always helpful to see and work with, whether it's line shapes or value, as abstract as possible. So before this dries too much, I want to begin to, and this is why, would it affect how much, if so, if it overlaps or bleeds into my figure. So I want this to be just a little darker in the front where we have more light, and maybe a little bit lighter on this back end here where we have more shadows. So it'll be more backlit in the back, creating that contrast, and a little darker in the front, or more saturated. It's not darker value. And I want a lot of this to be just gestural, but I do have to handle edges, so it may bleed just a little bit in And we could somehow figure out a way to use that. Now, if the colors are too close, or you feel they're not creating, I still recommend make it about value. Find a way by pushing the color just a little bit. Maybe with warmer, just a touch of red. But the less complexity you bring into it, the better. This right now may seem very monotone, very bland, but you will see when it dries and it begins to granulate and begin to obviously add more contrast. You'll see a richness that comes from that simplistic approach. Less is more as the formula. That's a good philosophy. I am going to touch just a little bit of that. And because I do see it, just a hint of that. And there's a sense of it, it's like a warmer, almost pink feel to some of these areas. But we don't want to move too quick or too drastic. I almost wanted a bit of just dramatic brush strokes, so it would be kind of showing a little movement, like radial movement, but actually just kept it plain, more atmospheric, where you see a little hint of darker or lighter, but it's simply that, a background. So I think it's time for me to switch brushes to a smaller, and they're going to get smaller and then smaller. As I go back to this goethite, to my brown, and I want to, once again, find that range. So I'm moving from lightest to darker to darkest. So going back to that low value, but it's going to be just a little bit more saturated than that previous layer. And these next steps, what you want to do is really truly begin your observation exercise. Again, the simplicity of it is how do I find, number one, the value? So easiest way here is layer. If you use the same value and then you just layer them, the second and third layer will be darker than the first. And the bigger and simpler, the better. You can always, oops, it's still a little wet there. And do I want some of that? Yeah, we could use it. We begin to have a little bit of that edge and linear. Shaping of some of these values. So what I'm doing is I'm just dabbing a little bit of paint here, trying to stay away from the background, the edges. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring in just a touch, clean that, wipe just enough moisture, and I'm going to start softening some of these edges by bringing just a little more water and letting it gradually, as I said earlier, give me more, a bigger range of values. So as you can see, it's going to take a little bit of patience. Going back and forth, bringing just a touch where you begin to see. And it's the level of patience you have to start off with those light, dark areas that are light and work them up. As they get darker and darker without rushing. And just make it about play. Playing with technique. Seeing how far you can push that. And what new approaches you can incorporate here. So we begin to have some shadow shapes. My secret here, or my biggest thing I want to be doing, oops, see right here, we need a small brush, and it's a dry brush to make sure we control some of this bleeding. Do not want that, and it's going to be a lot of it now because we still have that very wet, very, very wet background. So I'm going to bring in just a little bit of that by drying it with the paper towel and making sure I have the right timing. With some of this more and more linear. And eventually it comes down to that. To adding a shape that is almost a line and then softening the edges of those lines to create that illusion of light shadow. And it's all done through shifting the value. Now your sense of value here, that is, it's not the easiest thing to manage. Well, how do I know what's light, what's shadow, and what level of light or shadow in that value scale should I be aiming for? Generally speaking, just like with everything else, keep it as light as possible, as long as possible, knowing you can darken it. Now there are shapes and brushstrokes that need to be captured, because going back and reworking them will give you a different quality, a different look. So those where you need to be sure of that value and make sure they're captured, the easiest way would be by comparison. So whatever is next to it. So by contrast, I begin to have darker areas of the wing here, and I could easily see how the light, I want to begin to make these a little more gestural. As I see some of these lights and folds, I want to let the water and the pigment do most of this work. So I begin to work a little more wet on dry, or as I push and pull some of that edge, some of that pigment, and I have a little more water, I try to do a little bit of wet on wet. And this is where it becomes a test to patience. When we're dealing with the levels of moisture to capture that absolute magic, in this case, texture, light, movement, line, shape, it is absolutely down to, can you wait? Can you measure? All of the things you need in your mind. The mixture of pigment, the value of it, the consistency, the moisture on the brush, and then most importantly, the moisture on the paper in order to achieve the look that you're trying to achieve through that technique. All of that as your technique, measuring through, once again, patience. Even though it could be more gestural, it is truly back and forth from the palette, seeing it and letting it be. Not losing track of areas where I could come back. And if you've ever heard, like a chef, they have the grill where this is hotter, medium, and this is less heat. So you could cool it or let it just take its time. Same here. As I work wet and fresh wet, the level of moisture of the previous stage, where, for example, up here, is going to be maybe perfect right now. So as you measure that, as you move around, not forgetting that you could not just sit there and wait until it's, watching paint dry, in this case, paint and paper dry, but actually keep moving, keep working, not losing track of where you need to come back to, and begin to add those brush strokes at that perfect moment, that magic moment we call with watercolor, that are automatic, one and done. As you lay it down, you could see the magic happening. And then also having the patience to let it do what it knows how to do. It's that battle for control. Who's in control here? Is it me? Me with my brush in my hand, or is it the water and the pigment? So my paper is still very wet, and anything I bring in, dab, and I'm still playing with levels of value on my palette, a big spectrum of it, but I want to begin to play with some of these more, again, these are linear shapes, of shadow. They're also full of movement, somewhat transparencies. So we slowly and gently draw and create those values. So what I do there is I bring in a little darker value. It's not the darkest. As I lay it down, I then bring in a little more moisture on my brush, but then I touch it with my paper towel to find that perfect, almost lifting. It's almost lifting and wet on wet at the same time, where I could soften some of that edge and still see it as line, so you could see the shift in value. But it's very, very measured in terms of consistency of pigment that I lay down, the amount of moisture I need to bring in an area, for example, like this. See, that's a little bit of pigment, bring in a little water. This time I want it a little bit wetter, and then we soften that edge. Adding a little more water to this side, and maybe bringing in, again, it's going to be maybe a little too wet here, but I like that sort of unexpected, chaotic surprise element to it. And begin to work it that way. Not forgetting, still very wet, but less than before, and it's giving me a little bit of a different shape, a different line, and a different texture. So all of that patient rewards. It's just something that couldn't be done before, that now can be, although it's not what I visualized, and still works. And then once again, layer it, softly soften that edge. Softly soften that edge, very delicately. I mean, they are soft drapes, and you see the turn and twist of the torso because of those lines. You see a little bit of weight and gravity on those as well, because of the shape of those. And, well, besides the background, which was a different pigment, notice that I've only used one pigment here. And already we have that volume showing through, which is what we wanted. Again, don't forget your place. I was here, and I want this line to be just a little darker, but not stiff. Once it dries, we have that hard edge. So I want it to be a little softer, just like all the others. Bring in a little bit more water, soften that edge. Not overdoing it. I want that light. So I'm going to dab it, lift a little bit, and then revisit it, sharper line. And that's what it takes. We bring it, we continue bringing a little bit at a time. And this is not the only way, just so you know. This is one way of 7 billion ways for you to find the way that you need to manage those values. And it could be, again, as I said, more gestural with more of this dry brush. I'm leaving this completely as is. Some areas, some brush strokes just come together, and it's perfection. You do not want to, once you have it, to undo it. So as you notice, I get a little more consistency and also a little bit more linear. And trying to let those lines, the edges, dry just enough before I bring the layer, so it actually looks like fabric. And I am tempted to try and showcase just a little bit if I bring in a shade of this color for some of these darker shadows. But I think right now it's working so well. It's a big risk. And if you do try that, you'll notice it all over. one tiny area where I shift that into darker shadows or a second color could pretty much alter this entire study. So I'll hold off just a little longer. Sometimes these type of challenges are your best teacher. You actually get a really true good sense of how you're managing, like I said, in this case, simple, plain and easy, values. But it shows you not just values in a beautiful drawing, how you manage this subject, but your level of patience and also technical skills with watercolor, how you're choosing to solve the problem. And when we talk simplicity, one pigment, one technique, although here we have a few techniques going on, and I mentioned that wet on wet, wet on dry, and that softening of line, which is also a little bit of that wet on wet approach, a little bit of lifting. But as you can see, it's not much. It still remains somewhat simple, and it gives you a great idea in the end. The things you can achieve with little. And more you see that. You see, especially with chefs, the raw ingredients and how to create beautiful dishes with just raw ingredients, and what you can do with that. Same principle here. Really beginning to understand that famous saying of less is more. So my level of moisture all around, and especially here in the background, it's becoming perfect for that. It's incredible when you do wet on wet with that, where you can actually see the movement of the pigment, and almost you do feel like you're in control. And that's what you want. You want to get there. And it's almost that reverse psychology where watercolor makes you think you're in control. But it is you making that decision. And when you're there, you want watercolor to pretty much take over. Do it. You just want to dab it in and see it. And I wish I could show you a little closer, because you have to be very close to see what's happening to the pigment, what it is doing with water. And you could see it just as it comes together here, that it creates all those additional values that I was looking for. So very happy with the drawing. I'm going to still use this smaller brush and revisit sort of a second or third layer here, where I may bring in a little bit of the background color, mix it with this goethite, and dab it on here. So you see the level of consistency. Ooh, it changed drastically. You don't want to have those big, drastic jumps. And maybe this is the wrong brush. It's a little too small. I did want a little more of a sharp edged line, so this brush is perfect for that. But it does take a little extra brush stroke in order to deliver. So I'll switch over to a just from a 1 to a 3. Get that brush ready to go. That's better. And begin to leave some of that edge of the brush stroke, as you can see here. Sometimes we think we have to capture all of the detail, and what you see as detail is completely different from what someone else. There are those absolutely essential, in this case, features or lines that we all see. Those are the ones you want to capture. But some of us see things that really are not necessary, are not there, or don't. What I would call it is overcook. Sometimes the word was not relevant. Although they're there, they're not essential. And how do we know that? Well, it's through experience. The more you see, the more you work, the more it begins to make sense. And it is sort of an editor job. You are editing information. And the best example is if I show you a smiley face. Well, you think it's a face, 2 eyes, a mouth, but it's just a circle with a couple lines. That's what was essential. And you could bring that to, no, it's a little bit further, more information needed. All the way to, again, photorealistic. So pushing this almost to the, it's not even the darkest, it's not a dark pigment, staining pigment wise. But I'm almost there. And it's still giving. It's still giving me transparency and some of that beautiful granulation. So I may be going into that space where I was just talking about, where I'm adding non-essential shapes or lines here. And just a couple of last squints. Hard squints to really see where we need to bring in highest contrast in terms of shadows. I like the way the light worked. I could do a little bit better, a few transitions, and we're still pretty safe to do that with some of the layers that I have going on here. As simple as just bringing a little extra water with just the stain of the pigment for a little roundness, a little more granulation. but all of it patiently without rushing, because we're at the stage now where every single mark, it's beyond solving a problem, creates a new one. And you better be ready to answer the questions. As you continue adding, you create more problems. Notice this contrast here. And everything that's around it is affected by it. So it's reaching a point where it's almost just thick paint, and I don't want it to go that far. But there's a lot of three-dimensionality there. We could see flow and movement. There are going to be areas where a few touches of extra contrast, just like that. And the more abstract, again, the better. Will give us a better reading of light. And there we have it. The victory of Samothrace. Perfect for value study. And I would also test maybe different, in case of watercolor, to work with inks or some other water-soluble medium, but also different colors, going from a warm to a cool, or if you take it further, to a mixture of colors to try to achieve that more natural marble rock look. But you see how much fun this can be. I hope you enjoyed it.